Stop the world!
We have to continue to have conversations about our values, about the inappropriateness of domestic surveillance, about smart cities, safe cities that are really the opposite, that are being used to monitor citizens, and why this should be a concern. Why those efforts are actually undermining your sovereignty and national security.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm Justin Bassey. Welcome back, Liv.
Thanks, Justin. I have to say, it's a really great week to be back in the office.
Is that because Dave's away and we're about to head into a long weekend?
No, what I was going to say is that it's a double episode week for the pod, but the long weekend isn't bad either.
Yes, that's true. Today we bring you the second episode of the week, an interview with the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Cyberspace at the US Department of State, Jennifer Bachus.
ASPI's Bart Hogeveen interviews Jennifer, and they cover off on all things cybersecurity and tech diplomacy, including how the US government is approaching cybersecurity and how it's working with and supporting partners to increase their resilience in the cyber domain.
We need to continue to expand the coalition of those willing to hold states accountable and use their authorities, and then also use various multilateral groupings to, again, try to internationalize this, multilateralize this. So it's not just a small group of like-minded countries saying this is unacceptable. We need to make it unacceptable on a worldwide stage.
They discuss the challenges governments face to keep the cyber domain secure and the value and importance of attribution as a deterrent and awareness-raising tool.
But I do think that, when we do attributions, when we call out countries, I think sometimes it's not just about the country we're calling out. It's also to say to others, we're watching, this is not acceptable. And if you do it, we're going to impose consequences.
I think that's enough from us. I hope all of our Australian-based listeners enjoy the long weekend. Over to Bart and Jennifer.
Welcome, Jennifer Bachus, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Cyberspace at the US Department of State. Thank you so much for joining me on the ASPI podcast for our special series, the Sydney Dialogue Summit Sessions. It's great to talk with you again after, you may not remember, but your visit to ASPI in December 2022, I think, where you landed after with quite a bit of a jet lag and being shipped around by the US Embassy here in Canberra. But I'm really looking forward to meet you again, but also to today speak about a range of cyber issues that are affecting Australia, the US, our bilateral relations, as well as our common relations in our region. As we see almost daily reports of data hacks, ransomware, digital surveillance, theft of trade secrets, and espionage. Those are all kind of the juicy topics, but I'd like to start with how cyber and tech diplomacy as a policy area, as a function, has evolved within the US system, and particularly within State Department, but because you did not come into this role with a cyber and tech background at all, right?
That's correct. I did not. I'm a career diplomat. But we have a lot of experts on our team, which is how the career diplomats can pretend to know a lot about cyber, is because we get well trained by the people who've been working on these issues for decades.
Yes, and the State Department was one of the very first to establish a dedicated cyber role, with Chris Painter appointed at the time in 2009 as the first coordinator. Obviously, since then, cyber issues have evolved and gained in prominence. But within the US system, we've seen quite a bit of restructuring, movements of the cyber function within state and within the wider US government system. And I would say also, within the Australian government, at least at the federal level, we're grappling with this question. How do we most effectively organize ourselves on the domestic side as well as on the foreign policy side? Does it need a dedicated function under an ambassador like you have, like we have? Or are we better off mainstreaming it across the various foreign policy areas, international security, human rights, trade, international assistance, and so on? And no doubt learning from what has worked well on your end, as well as what worked less well in other systems. The Bureau for Cyber and Digital Policy was established only quite recently in April 2022. And I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that I think your oversight body, the Government Accountability Office, just this year acknowledged that the Bureau's establishment, and I quote, helped to better position states to achieve its cyber diplomacy goals, end of quote, by consolidating its digital efforts within one centralized component led by an ambassador at large, rather than spreading them out across the department. So I'm really interested to hear your reflections on this development journey, which I'm assuming it must have been for State Department and for the Bureau, and what are your lessons learned in articulating cyber as a foreign policy priority?
For the question. And I think I'll start maybe with your first point, which actually maybe the GAO report also answered, which is this question of mainstreaming versus dedicated. And I think from us, it's actually both. It's not an either or answer. We think that there both needs to be a dedicated point of contact, a lead on this, which is our bureau, where we work on not just cybersecurity, but also digital economy and digital freedom. We have a dedicated foreign assistance team, so we can think about how do you reach out to developing countries, et cetera. At the same time, we consider these issues to be horizontals and not a vertical, where everybody is touching on these issues in some way, and everybody needs to have at least some basic understanding. But there's a difference between basic understanding and in-depth knowledge. So essentially, the idea is if you're working in our Asia Bureau or you're working in our Export Control Office, you're going to know something, but you're going to reach like the bottom of what you know. And then you come to us, you bring us in, and we provide sort of a back office support function. Similarly, in the US government, we're not the only ones playing in this space. We, of course, have the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Agency. We have at the Department of Commerce, the NTIA, NIST, like a bajillion people working on these issues at Commerce, at the US Trade Representative's Office, at the White House. I could go on and on. Department of Defense. I mean, really, you name a part of the US government, an agency at the US government, they're touching on these topics and we're working with them. But we view foreign ministries as having a particularly important role to play because, first of all, we are the main leads on foreign policy and engaging with foreign countries. And these issues are inherently transnational. Right. We also, and this is something I think about very regularly, the State Department, our foreign ministry, is one of the very few parts of the US government that thinks about both national security and economic prosperity. We are attempting to balance these two. And as you think about some of the ways that we need to address cybersecurity, you have to be balancing those two issues. If you get too far off base, you're going to hurt your economy or you're going to undermine your national security. So we need to balance them. Over the last couple of years, since we were stood up as an integrated function, again, as you noted, cybersecurity was dealt with for many years in the State Department. Our economic development, digital economy team, call them what you want. They also existed for decades. They were the lead in the International Telecommunications Union. But the idea was we should all work together because as you think about issues like undersea cables or 5G or cloud, these have both cybersecurity elements and economic elements, and you need to think about them all together. You can secure all the infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have basic cybersecurity built in from the outset, you're still going to have data breaches. There's going to be attacks. You're going to have espionage. So you need to actually think about these issues holistically. And then they also wanted to bring in this values component. Because ultimately, when you think about what we're battling over internationally, it is our values. It's the idea of what we hold dear. It's the idea that we want people to have freedom of expression. We want their privacy to be respected. We want them to be able to have meaningful access to information and connectivity. Not just, you don't just land a subsea cable to land a subsea cable. You're doing it so people can both have economic prosperity, but also have access to information.
And then there's obviously also kind of the economic commercial component to that as well. But let's move, let's say, to I think a key example of where you have to balance, I think, the national security element with kind of the human rights elements, as well as managing the balance of global consensus. And that's the UN Convention Against Cybercrime that was adopted last week in New York after a couple of years of negotiations, which was an initiative that the Russian Federation initiated back in 2019. At the time, the US and also Australia was vehemently opposed. You voted against the establishment of the ad hoc committee that would deliberate the convention in the first place, together with 59 other states. But now we are 5 years later and many rounds of negotiations later, and the US has endorsed the convention. I think the official line is welcome the adoption of the Convention Against Cybercrime. Can you tell us a little bit what has changed between 2019 and 2024?
So if you are correct that we did not originally endorse the ad hoc committee, we were concerned that Russia intended to use the process to push its authoritarian approaches to the internet. But this was something that had massive widespread desire by countries around the world. What I find is as I travel, cybercrime is not in our main mandate. But this is the number one issue that gets raised with me, particularly in developing countries, but not just in developing countries. They're concerned. They're concerned about scams. They're concerned about ransomware. They're concerned about all of the cybercrime elements. And so you have two options on these things. You can either continue to say, this is terrible. Russia launched this, so therefore we're not going to do anything. Or you can figure out how you turn the script and you make sure that this is a convention that respects human rights, that addresses these issues while still allowing law enforcement cooperation to go after cyber criminals wherever they are. And so that is what we did. We ensured that the negotiations produced a convention that supported the goals of the United States and our allies and partners. And we worked extremely closely with the government of Australia on this. And we wanted to make sure it tracked the long-standing, rights-respecting framework set out by the Budapest Convention. And that's what we view as the gold standard. And so it did take years of negotiation. It was a crazy, impressive effort by the people who were in there every day, explaining what our red lines were, explaining our desire to have a convention that we could sign on to, while noting that we wouldn't sign on to just anything, because we're not going to undermine our values. We're not going to give up the things we hold dear. At the same time, we have to allow really important cooperation. So, if adopted, the convention will expand international cooperation on cybercrime, provide the UN a standard for the fight against cybercrime, and allow us to have ongoing government and stakeholder collaboration. I should say, last week's action was just one step in a multi-step process, although one, as you said, we welcomed because we do think it's incredibly important to work together on cybercrime and to have the safeguards so that countries, including the United States, are not compelled to hand over information that's not really a crime. It's about freedom of expression. So we think that there was a really good effort to have something that we could feel comfortable signing on to, and that are like-minded countries as well, and to meet really the moment when it comes to cybercrime.
I know you can't, let's say, prejudge what's going to happen next because, the convention will be put forward to the General Assembly later this year. It still needs to be adopted by majority by all 193 member states, and then it's open for signatures by individual member states. Can we expect the US to sign up to the convention? We've seen a few countries, I think, still expressing great concerns. It needs to meet a minimum benchmark of 40 signatures to get in force. What's your expectation as to what probably the next administration will do?
Look, there's going to be an internal U.S. process, as there is for everything. That is how democracies work. It's not one person who gets to decide. And I think continuing to see how it's carried out, how it's portrayed, how people are talking about will ultimately determine whether we sign or ratify the convention. So I think this is one step. We think it was a critically important step. I don't want to prejudge the internal conversations that will have to continue to happen. But again, I think underscoring the importance of these safeguards and the importance of a mutually agreeable view of these safeguards and what this convention is and is not. Because every once in a while, people are still misportraying what it is. And they're saying that it covers way more crimes than it does. And they're misrepresenting it. It is very narrow. It's purposely focused, narrowly focused. So I think we need to ensure that there remains a very strong understanding of it. One of the things I've repeatedly talked to, internally within the US government is about when the framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace was adopted, when you had the government group of experts right? There was a lot of skepticism there too. And those were Russian initiatives. And in fact, what we've had to do is really bilateral and multilateral engagement to explain to countries, what does that thing say? What does it not say? And to build a general awareness around those issues. Because of course, countries can always try to misrepresent what this convention or what the framework of responsible state behavior says. And so what we need to do is engage bilaterally with countries, ensure they understand their ability to enforce the safeguards, to ensure they don't adopt cybercrime treaty legislation that will criminalize freedom of expression. But we can do all those things. We've done it before. It just takes a similar effort of what Australia, the United States, and other like-minded countries around the world have done.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. And I can resonate with that in terms of, let's say, post 2015, when the norms of responsible state behavior were adopted. There has been kind of, since then, almost 10 years of efforts to train, to raise awareness, but also to operationalize what does this mean in practice for individual states, for individual government agencies. And then how do they also demonstrate that they follow and sort of implement agreed norms? I just wanted to touch back briefly on the Cybercrime Convention. And I recognize everything that you said, is that whenever you talk to, in our case, let's say counterparts in Southeast Asia or in the Pacific, if cyber is a priority at all, then cybercrime is their main cyber priority. And I think we've been still relatively slow to come to the table and recognize that, and also put investments there of a nature that makes a tangible difference. And at the same time, what you hear is, or what you feel is, a sense of being helpless and powerless. What can we do as kind of small administrations, small law enforcement agencies that don't have the forensic skills, the digital skills, or even the personnel to deal with cybercrimes, but then also having to deal with oftentimes countries unwilling to collaborate or are harboring kind of criminals quite deliberately. And I think that's where kind of that convening, the ability to convene for, let's say, larger countries, such as the US, such as Australia, I think comes in. Yeah, how do you see that? What do you see as kind of tangible things that the US and Australia individually, but also maybe collaboratively, can bring to the table to support, say, countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific to effectively address cybercrime, noting it is the biggest cyber priority?
So I would say there's the things we're already doing. We work a lot through ASEAN, for example. It's something we address both in our cybersecurity engagements as well as in our digital economy engagements. So we're doing sort of capacity building, understanding, awareness raising, those sorts of things. I think that's the first thing that we have to continue to do. I think the potential of the convention to actually allow mutual law enforcement cooperation, to be able to actually do mutual legal assistance, I think is incredibly important. We also have in the United States what are called iChips advisors. I can't tell you what that stands for because it was a very, cleverly articulated name. But the idea is, right, to help the smaller countries figure out how to craft their legislation, how to enforce their legislation, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. We've been doing this work for a long time. We'll continue to do this work. And I think it will just get reinforced through the convention. But it really is about one-on-one engagement, and then looking for those bodies like ASEAN where countries do want to engage on these issues. And I think we'll need to continue to do that so that countries do take this seriously, and so that countries feel like they have the tools at their disposal to actually combat cybercrime. I think some of it's very, very difficult. And I think we can't pretend like there's an easy answer. There's no easy answer. Scams are getting more pervasive. They're more sophisticated. I was just in Singapore and I was hearing about some of the ones that they're seeing there. The other element of this, of course, is ransomware. And I will skip ahead to the question of ransomware. So we have built out over the last few years with the US White House leadership, a coalition in the part of the Counter Ransomware Initiative. We're about to host the third convening of this at the end of September and beginning of October. We have almost 70 members of the Counter Ransomware Initiative at this time. And it just shows how many countries want to come together to fight ransomware, who see ransomware as a pervasive threat, as something that does require international coalitions, that does require international work to combat. Again, it's not going to solve everything, but there are, as through the Counter Ransomware Initiative, there's work on the law enforcement side, there's work on the diplomacy side, there's work on the capacity building side. And I think it's type of cybercrime that we do need to continue to work together on.
And do you foresee that? I think the Counter Ransomware Task was an example that really kind of rallied initially a small group of countries and agencies together to find a particular topic, a particular concern, sort of the day. Do you see these instruments, such as kind of threat-based task forces, be expanded to other areas as well? So, I mean, we've now dealt with kind of ransomware. The next threat could be cryptocurrencies, or the next threat could be kind of an other technology-related crimes or security incidents. Do you see this as the mechanism for the US and its partners and allies to deal with these issues? So will we see more task forces?
I think, well, we need to actually reinforcing and addressing ransomware, I think, has to be really the focus of the Counter Ransomware Initiative at this time. I think overly expanding its scope is just going to dilute what is an incredibly important thing. I think that there is a role for sort of these pretty large groupings, the Counter Ransomware Initiative, and then there's still a role for organizations like the United Nations. We're not giving up on the United Nations. We remain extremely involved in the open-ended working group. We're very focused on the program of action to have an actual action-oriented, results-driven engagement in the United Nations. There are so many countries who still rely on the United Nations, who want to work through the United Nations. I don't think we can give up on that. We also find the International Telecommunications Union to be a collaborative actor in certain cases. If you're trying to figure out how to support small and medium-sized businesses to undertake their basic cybersecurity, right? Because how do you have, there are sophisticated scams. There are sophisticated criminal actors, and there are actors who are not so sophisticated. We need to really address basic cybersecurity to reduce some of these. And then you're still addressing some of the more sophisticated actors. But I think, I'm surprised we've gotten this far into the conversation and you haven't mentioned artificial intelligence. I can't have a conversation.
I'm trying to do my best.
Artificial intelligence doesn't come up. It's important in the cybersecurity conversation, right? Because cybersecurity will make, some actors, some adversaries more capable. But the idea is that it should also make it easier to up our game on cybersecurity. And that's, what we need to do, particularly for some of the less capable parts of our societies that need to have basic cybersecurity, is use some of these AI tools so that they can also resist the intrusions that are coming from both state and non-state actors.
I don't want to dismiss, let's say, the AI angle to this, but I would like to touch back on the forum that you mentioned, the UN Open-Ended Working Group on international cybersecurity, because I was reading through the strategy that the State Department or the administration launched a couple of months back, which articulates, I think, a whole range of priorities, but also on what we just mentioned, responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The strategy recognizes that norms that we all agreed are not self-enforcing, and that, in fact, some states, and I think the US refers particularly to Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, are seen to act contrary to it. Essentially, what we're seeing is that what's been agreed in New York and in bilateral legal level talks is being violated on the ground in day-to-day cyber operations. And in fact, we've seen that ourselves as well in our research, where since 2015, we've seen the number of reported state-sponsored or state-supported cyber operations have quadrupled, over more than 100 on an annual basis at this point in time. But I think what's sometimes lost in the conversation is the fact that about 80% is dealing with espionage or intelligence collection operations, and I would say only 20% are the ones that we see in the media reported as kind of the destroy and destruct type of cyber attacks. So that's, I think, one observation. The other observation is, despite all the efforts that we've just talked about, we obviously see no change in behavior from some of the states, some of the governments that I just mentioned. So how now, let's say in the next years ahead, how can the US, in partnership with the likes of Australia and others, move from kind of these mere principles to being in a position to really hold other states to account, but also change behavior? Because I think that's the one thing we don't see, is that we can set up a new task force on anything. Essentially, the behavior by states or states allowing criminal organizations to operate from their territory, that it seems not to be changing. What's the US view on this?
Well, I think I would say I would have a couple of comments. I will start with yes, we continue to see actions and very concerning actions out of Russia, the PRC, North Korea, and Iran. And we would not minimize those. It's very concerning. But I think that what we haven't seen is a lot more actors coming to the table. So what you can never prove what hasn't happened. But I do think that, when we do attributions, when we call out countries, I think sometimes it's not just about the country we're calling out. It's also to say to others, we're watching, this is not acceptable. And if you do it, we're going to impose consequences. And there are countries where that does make a difference. There are countries where it doesn't. But I would also say that, we will continue to work with allies and partners to condemn it and to impose meaningful consequences with all of the tools we have. So in the context of Russia and its continued provision of safe haven to cyber criminals and enablement of malicious cyber activities, we were really pleased to be able to work with United Kingdom and Australia to specifically designate a leader of the Russian designated Lockbit group for his role in developing and distributing Lockbit ransomware. We announced a reward under our transnational organized crime rewards program of up to $10 million for information leading to his arrest. And of course, the Justice Department unveiled charges against him. And we also did other indictments and designations of others involved with Lockbit's operations. And we did the cybersecurity advisories. Now, seems like a lot of words, but I got to tell you, people don't like being designated. They don't like having a target on their head. So there are real world things we can do, and we will continue to do those things. And we will continue to call out Russia for harboring cybercriminal actors. We will make it clear that that's unacceptable, and we will designate them as appropriate. So I think that we need to continue to do those things, and we need to continue to expand the coalition of those willing to hold states accountable and use their authorities, and then also use various multilateral groupings to, again, try to internationalize this, multilateralize this. So it's not just a small group of like-minded countries saying this is unacceptable. We need to make it unacceptable on a worldwide stage.
The other thing that we are seeing, I think, in our part of the world is that a growth in cyber capabilities of various states. So we see new defense cyber units being stood up. We see cybersecurity agencies being stood up, let's say, in the national security portfolios, which comes on top of where I think our region has been historically relatively strong with a national CERT, so the National Computer Emergency Response Teams. We typically operate not in the security portfolio, but more in the economics or in the telecommunications portfolio. But what's striking to see, to me at least, is that these new agencies that I just mentioned do seem to have a very strong, both externally facing character, so to kind of defend networks against foreign interferences. In some cases, they even refer to kind of offensive operations or preventive operations. But there's also the risk, and this is tying back, I think, to the start of our conversation, it also refers to the use of cyber capabilities for domestic purposes, domestic security purposes, and in cases to suppress some of the human rights and the fundamental freedoms that are foundational to your strategy, to your foreign policy outlook, as well as to ours. What's your general take on the region and where it's developing, where its cyber capabilities are developing? What are some of the promising signs, but also what are some of the concerning signs from a US perspective?
I think that you do see a variety of actions being taken. And I think that is actually the creation of cybersecurity agencies that can do the basics, not the surveillance of their population. Of course, that's always something we're going to push back on, but to defend their own networks, to make sure as countries around the world, what they tell me is they want to digitize, right? They want to actually be able to provide services to their populations, whether it's birth certificates if you live in a rural area, access to voting if you live in rural areas, basic government services. This is the thing that I hear all the time. Well, as you put those services online, you better make sure your cybersecurity is well done, or ultimately you're creating, the best place to try to go after if you're a ransomware actor. So we need to make sure as countries digitize, they have cybersecurity built in from the outset. And I think that's what we're looking at and what we're talking about, right? And so we have this concept, and I can't believe we got this far into the podcast before talking about AI. I haven't used our term digital solidarity, which was one of the key elements of our strategy. And the idea of digital solidarity has a whole range of things in it, but part of it is international coalition, countries around the world coming together, both to, develop the technologies of tomorrow, but also defend when there are intrusions, when bad things happen. And I think for us, the more countries that are able to actually defend their own networks, the better it is. Again, we have to continue to have conversations about our values, about the inappropriateness of domestic surveillance, about smart cities, safe cities that are really the opposite, that are being used to monitor citizens, and why this should be a concern. Why those efforts are actually undermining your sovereignty and national security. What you think today is a good idea in the future is actually going to lead to massive vulnerabilities. But this requires really regular engagement. It's why the State Department, why this bureau was stood up, because we can do this from Washington all the time. But we are most effective when our embassies, which are in so many countries around the world, are able to go in and engage on a person-to-person basis with the decision makers, oftentimes in really close coordination with our like-minded partners like Australia in your region. We can go in and we can say, look, here's how we think about these issues. Here's how you can address the sustainable development goals, have economic prosperity, and have national security, but not do it in a way that undermines your core values or puts into threat what, your people actually hold dear. And that requires really people to people engagement, and it's a ground game, right? You can come in from the outside. I can go, our ambassador at large can go and have these conversations, but it's more effective if our people in the field are able to do it and they have the tools to do so, which is why, we're trying to enable them. We're giving them training. We also like to, again, much like for the rest of the State Department, for the people in the field, we like to say, look, we're your back office. You don't understand what this thing is. Like, do you like open source? Do you not like open source? Do you like the way this new cybersecurity agency is being built up? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Right. And so we can help them guide through those questions and say, okay, well, you added this thing in there. You want to do offensive, which, by the way, yes, we hear that. Lots of countries now want to do offensive cyber. And then we start asking questions. Okay, well, what's the goal of that? You haven't even gotten the foundation of basic cybersecurity right. Let's work on the foundation first before you start trying to go into, more advanced capabilities. And I think going in, trying to figure out what countries are actually attempting to do, and then working with them, through our foreign assistance tools, through our diplomatic tools, through our collaboration. I think that's where you're the most successful, is by going in and engaging and recognizing that every country has different laws. Every country has a different culture and a different history and a different government structure. So when we do this engagement, we don't say, copy the US model. We say, okay, well, what do you have? Where would it make sense? You want somebody who's got some overarching, vision of this, but then you need to divide it up. But cybersecurity is, as we started out the podcast with, it's a horizontal, right? So ultimately, every part of a government should be thinking about it. If you're the energy part or the interior part or the homeland security part, everybody has to be thinking about cybersecurity because digital is built into everything we do today.
No, and I'm glad you bring up this notion of digital solidarity, which I think is the linking pin for the strategy that you put out a couple of months ago. And I do recognize that when you engage in other parts of the region, where we tend to, let's say, look at cyber initially and mostly from a security perspective, and then maybe from a safety perspective, that's not the case in many other parts of the world, where it is essentially, and in first place, either a developmental prerogative because you can get connected. You can engage in online commerce, so it's kind of an enabler for the economy, but also that motivation to digitize the economy and to kind of jump onto Industry 4.0 opportunities. That's kind of the talk of the time when you, for instance, engage in Southeast Asia. So it's way more that developmental and economic lens that's driving conversations, I think, in major parts of the world that we often tend to forget, and we jump straight into kind of the safety and security aspects of it. So, yeah, I do recognize that as well. So I'm really kind of interested to see how digital solidarity notion is playing out also through programs such as USAID or your DCCP projects that are being rolled out in the region. We coming to a close of our conversation, and I think we covered a lot of ground. To me, it shows, and that's where I started off the conversation, that the broader cyber agenda that we see ourselves confronted with quite honestly stretches the limits of most democracies, and in particular, I think the ministries of foreign affairs or the state departments of this world. But it also shows to me that it is a very particular area of diplomacy, and not in the technical sense, but in the skill sets required to engage with, and you mentioned that, engage with and negotiating with other states, competitors, allies, but also partners and development partners, as well as with industry, civil society, academics, and the technical community. The folks who actually keep the network running and make it safe and secure and accessible. So I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today. Finally, we'd like to ask each of our guests if they have any book recommendations, old-style conventional books, not AI generated, on topics that we've been discussing today or that you find really inspiring. So do you have a book that you would recommend our listeners to read?
Well, a little off, but I have to say it anyway. So if you haven't read my boss's book, Nate Pick, One Bullet Away, you should definitely read that. I don't get any profits from it. But the reason I would pitch it is because it really talks about leadership. It talks about personal responsibility. It's also quite easy to read. He did not ask me to plug his book. Let me just be clear. But I do have to plug his book. And I think if people haven't read it, you should read it. But if not, if you want to be something more specific, we were able to have a really good conversation with the author of Chips Wars, Chris Miller, talking about what that looks like into the future. That's maybe a more on topic book than One Bullet Away. But, I'll put a plug in for One Bullet Away as well.
Thank you. We'll put One Bullet Away in the show notes of the podcast. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And thanks for a very interesting conversation.
Thanks to you.
That's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening.
And if you haven't yet checked out our video podcast, we recommend you head on over to ASPI's YouTube channel, ASPI Canberra, to check out the latest episodes. As always, we also welcome any feedback you might have on the pod, so please feel free to reach us at podcast@aspi.org.au. We'll be back with another episode next week.